كانت جزء لا يتجزأ من الدولة العثمانية.
We are being criticized for doing our job and for upholding the federal constitution. Like I have said in the past, I will not bend to such lame pressures and insinuations.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The Global South Network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
Global South Network provides a platform for meaningful dialogue and cooperation, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
May I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayad, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN. The Global South Network is a much admired initiative.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, civil society, legal community, etc.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 30th seminar in phase 4 of our International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. Before we begin, I would like to thank Dr. Nauman Rayat, lecturer in law at Leicester Law School and founder and chief convener of the Global South Network, for organizing this weekly seminar series. I'm chairing today's session. I'm Dr. Candice Moore. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of the Witwatersrand, also known as WITS, in Johannesburg, South Africa. I've been working in the field of international relations since 2001 as a researcher, lecturer, and supervisor. I obtained my PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2011. And a very close topic to Thaís' topic today. I looked at the foreign policies of South Africa and Brazil, and my work is in the broad area of the international relations of the Global South, specializing now in South Africa's foreign policy and the Global South and international relations theory. I'm joined by a discussant and a peer commentator. The discussant has just joined us, Dr. Helena de Moraes Achcar, is the discussant for today's session. She is a postdoctoral fellow at Fundação Getulio Vargas in Brazil. She did her PhD titled The Politics and Anti-Politics of South-South Cooperation, the Case of Brazil-Mozambique, Pro-Savannah and Anti-Retroviral Factory. And she did this at my alma mater, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and completed in 2019. Her recent publications include articles titled Rethinking Recipient Agency in South-South Cooperation, Strategies of Contestation, Strategies of Transformation, and the South's Own View of Development in the Journal of Development Studies. Christopher Hulshoff is also with us as a peer commentator for today's session. He's primarily interested in the proliferation of imperial power during the 20th and 21st centuries. In particular, he finds the reassertion of peripheral agency and diminishment of Western exceptionalism in transnational contexts quite compelling. His recent publications include The Voice from the Well, Norman Redaway, the Information Research Department and British Propaganda in Indonesia, in the Journal of Cold War Studies, and an article titled The Foreign Relations of the United States as a Tool for Comparative Research, the Brazilian and Indonesian coups of 1964-65, in the journal titled Diplomacy and Statecraft. Last but not least, the guest speaker today is Thaís Dória, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, where she holds the Chancellor's International Scholarship. Focusing on Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia, her ongoing PhD project investigates how these states narrate their standing within the international order, navigating the tension between aspirations for autonomy and the persistence of global hierarchies. The project combines qualitative content analysis of official speeches from the late 80s, early 90s to 2024, with elite interviews conducted during fieldwork. Today, Thaís will present her PhD project titled Hierarchy Reconsidered from the Middle, Ontological Positionality and Discourses of Standing in Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia. Thaís, you have 30 to 35 minutes for your presentation, followed by 5 minutes for comments or questions from both the discussant and the peer commentator. And if time permits, we will then have a 15-minute Q&A session with attendees. The screen is now yours.
Thank you everyone for being here, especially for those who are part of the panel, for agreeing to be part of it and to comment. I'm really happy to meet you all. I slightly changed the title. This gives you an idea of how ongoing my PhD is. I'm sure we will have another title by the end of the PhD. Just so to present myself, I'm Thaís. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Warwick, as Dr. Candice just mentioned. And today I will be presenting part of what I really want to present is the theoretical framework I'm developing. But I figured that for that, I would have to give you some context of which literature I'm dialoguing with. So I will sort of present my literature review chapter in the theoretical framework. Some overview of the presentation for today. I will start with the background and the motivation of my PhD research, and then I will discuss the literature that some might call new hierarchy studies in international relation theories, and then sort of the literature on middle power and rising power, and then I will show key blind spots in both literatures and how I try to overcome this or compensate with the theory that I'm proposing, that I call theory of discursive agency. And then I will touch ever so slightly on the methodology, the analytical framework, and show some preliminary findings from my fieldwork in Brazil. So the motivation and background for my research, as someone who did the master's degrees and undergraduate degrees back in Brazil, I was always fascinated by how the IR theories that we studied and how we conceptualize the world was mainly through Western theories that never really fully applied to the case of Brazil, but that's true for many other global South countries. So I always wondered why that was, why even studying in Brazil, these were the main theories that I came across during my formative years. So just for a little context and overgeneralization claims I will do now, but just for context, many IR theories still focus on the idea that anarchy is the main organizing principle of the international order, but many scholars have contested that, arguing that despite formal equality, what we understand as sovereignty, states are still unequal. They still have hierarchical positionings. Hence the idea of great powers, small powers, middle powers, and many other denominations. Still, even hierarchical studies still overly focused on the experience of great powers in trying to explain the international order. And that's the main gap that I'm trying to overcome with my thesis. But before doing so, I would just give you a little context of the literature that I'm trying to contribute to. For that, I did a fourfold typology of what some might call new hierarchy studies. As you can see, these slides are full with text. I just did that mainly for the commentators to have some background, but on the presentation, I will sort of try to be more concise. So the idea is, there are four main types of studies analyzing the international order as hierarchical. One is what I call utilitarian approach. These approaches to hierarchy see the international order and the actors within it as maximizing actors. So hierarchy sort of emerges from mutual beneficial arrangements. They usually focus on a relation of two countries. If the great power, for example, is incentivized to be part of the hierarchy, because this is how it sort of promotes authority, and the subordinate powers are incentivized to be part of the hierarchy because they are provided with public goods, especially security. Then there's the compact, what I call the compact approach to international hierarchies. Authors within this trend argue that we cannot understand hierarchy as a negotiation, as if these states had the choice to begin with to be part or not to be part of this hierarchy. And they try to explain not necessarily how hierarchy emerged, but how it works and how it endures over time. So they focus on the idea really present in constructivist schools of IR, the logic of appropriateness that says that states in certain positions know what appropriate behavior they should have in the international system, and this is sort of internalized, and states reproduce that over the time, and that's how hierarchy endures. And then there is this embedded and embodied hierarchies that push the limit of arguing beyond not only questioning how hierarchies emerged, but they posit that hierarchies are always present, so actors are always socialized within hierarchies, and this provides them with a sense of place and really routinized practices, and that are somewhat unreflexive. It's not as if they knew consciously where they stand and how this affected their behavior, but somehow it does. And then there are the critical approach to hierarchies that argue that we should also call attention to hierarchies of difference that are interrelated to these hierarchies of positions. So, for instance, how race, gender, ethnicity sort of interplay in these international hierarchies. So this is a really concise review, but really this is me trying to get to the theoretical framework I'm proposing, where I most want your feedback. And then there are some strands of the literature in IR that do not engage directly with hierarchy study. However, they are also concerned with matters of stratification and how this affects state behavior and discourses. So there's the middle power scholarship and the rising power scholarship. Middle power scholarship usually is split into three strands. Those that understand that what makes a state a middle power is based on its position in terms of material capabilities, so the size of the population, of the economy. There's also the behavioral strand that understands that middle power status is born out of how a state acts in the world. So middle powers would be more prone to, for example, bridge behavior, coalition building, multilateralism. And there are those that understand that in order for a state to be characterized as a middle power, it has to see itself as a middle power and be seen as a middle power. This is the identity approach. But this approach often treats role as stable and obvious, as if a position was always enacted and fully accepted by others, and not as if it was actually dynamic. So they rarely ask how these roles are narratively constructed, negotiated, or resisted. Similarly, rising power scholarship also is concerned with matters of stratification, but in the case of rising powers, they usually use the literature on power transition theories to sort of argue how rising powers, for example, China, might destabilize the international system, and what sort of behaviors rising powers might have due to hierarchies. So, for example, whether they will accommodate, contest. But yet again, as all of the literature that I have tried to talk about so far, there's a sense of unexpected behavior from position. So there's always the sense that if you are rising power, you are going to behave in this or that way. So there's this structural understanding of behavior. So discourse is always treated as a secondary variable, even though authors like Milner argues that beyond capabilities to be a rising power, there's also the need to have what she calls idea advocacy, which more or less would be a consent in the elite on a national project. But even still, most of this literature do not look beyond position to sort of argue for the sort of behavior that these actors will have in the international system. So then what I try to do with this literature review is to emphasize and highlight the three main blind spots from my perspective on hierarchy studies. First, there's this tendency to look at dyadic relations, so relation between two actors, and sort of try to extrapolate from this behavior to account for the whole international system, international order. And beyond that, not only they usually focus on a relation between two actors, but also from the perspective of the top. So as almost always a top-down perspective focused on what they call the superordinate power. So there's mixed complex multi-actor processes of hierarchical positioning. Also, there's what I was just saying, an under-theorization of agency. Most of these scholars and literature sort of deal with behavior as emerging from position and position being fixed in time. And also there is a neglect of how states themselves understand their position within international hierarchies and how they see the international system and how this might sort of affect how they narrate and behave in the international system. So there is where I try to introduce the theory of discursive agency by repositioning the analytical gaze from how hierarchical orders are imposed from the top towards how they are narrated, interpreted, and navigated from the middle. So a short description of what discussant agency would be is the capacity of states, particularly those liminal and in subordinate positions, to constitute themselves as legitimate and agentic participants in global politics from narrative and rhetorical practices. So there are some assumptions or premise from the theory of discursive agency that I'm proposing. First and foremost, the domestic and international spheres are assumed to be co-constituted in the framework and theory that I'm proposing. Also, the state is understood to be assemblage of narratives. So actors are constituted in and through language, or narratives, which locate them in time, space, and structure. In that sense, identity is not a category, but a relational location in social space. Foreign policy discourse, which is my object of analysis, is a relational practice through which states stake claims to intentionality, legitimacy, and efficacy. And lastly, agency is seen as a relationally emergent. So agency is not a pre-existing capacity. For example, if a state has a certain material capability, according to my theory, we would not necessarily expect a certain behavior. Rather, agency is a performative achievement under structured and unequal conditions. And this last part is really important because, crucially, my theory does not imply voluntarism, as if states could invent their roles freely, nor does it articulate a discourse ensure recognition or success. But discourses operate under conditions of structure inequality, sedimented norms, institutional legacies, and differential capacities for projection and reception. But positional claims must be as though positional claims must be recognized, legitimized, or contested by others. Meaning is not made unilaterally, yet, and this is the point that I want to call further attention, within these constraints, discourse become a terrain of agency. Positionality in my framework is a relational location constituted through narrative. So this part is still somewhat underdeveloped. So I'm looking forward for your comments on that sense. It might be actually completely removed, but let's try to just touch upon it and see if we can say something. So there are 4 dimensions to the theory of discursive agency that I'm developing. One is temporality, the idea that states make use of time, present, past, and future in a way to justify contemporary claims and positions. For example, how Indonesia uses its tradition of non-alignment, both in relation to Bandung, but also in relation to current foreign policy discourses and behavior. Also, the idea of relationality, that states are always in position and identities, characteristics, and positionalities emerge in relations. They are not pre or fixed or structural. Then there's also this dimension of selective appropriation. What I just mentioned about Indonesian law alignment reflects both historical memory and contemporary recalibration. And also the idea of employment. I sort of draw from narrative studies in IR, the idea that language is performative. So states use metaphors, analogies, and tropes to construct plots, delineate alleys and orders, and embed their actions in normative registers. So it's sort of this in Brazil, for example, we could see in the attempt of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to portray our foreign policy as cohesive over time. Indonesia does similarly always recur to this concept of bebas active, which means independent and free foreign policy in diverse themes, just to give an idea that there is a coherence in its foreign policy over time and a causal relationship to the behavior and the principle the country is trying to put forward. So then I'm sort of trying to now narrow down to how the analytical framework of my thesis. This is somewhat related to theory, somewhat related to methodology. I came across that. This sort of analytical framework is born out of my empirical analysis. So I really try to be inductive in how I raise this theory. And there are 6 main ideas, which I call, not ideas, typologies of discursive strategies that I sort of saw on the data, on the interviews, on the discourses. And the first one is legitimation. The purpose of this discursive strategy is to justify the state's role, choices, and international position as rightful, principle, and normatively grounded. Then there is differentiation to distinguish the state from others, especially less powerful or regionally proximate states, while avoiding direct confrontation with great powers. Then there is the discursive strategy of claim making to assert entitlements, whether material, symbolic, or procedural, within global or regional orders. For example, how Brazil and South Africa demands a reform of the United Nations Security Council, and how it frames this sort of discourses. And then there's the idea of ambiguation or liminality, to cultivate sort of a strategic ambiguity that preserves flexibility and minimize entrapment in rival alignments or obligations. Then there's the idea of recasting hierarchy. So what categories or narratives of hierarchy are resisted or inverted? How is the global order described or imagined differently? So in a sense, how these states interpret the international stratification in ways that open discursive space or shift the normative terrain. And finally, there is the discursive strategy of role performance, which is to enact an identity claim through performative discourses that signals reliability, coherence, and actorhood. So what recurring scripts or metaphors construct a sense of state selfhood? How are roles performed over time through discourse? And then here I come to the methodology, I have selected Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia. I can discuss the case selection criteria, but for now I will just skip it. And then what I do is I use qualitative content analysis to sort of analyze how speeches at the United Nations Security Council, United Nations General Assembly, regional institutions such as the African Union, ASEAN, Mercosur, national discourses, so how these foreign policy speeches and the interviews I conducted sort of portrayed and locate these countries within global hierarchies, how they understand their positions within global hierarchies, what concepts they use to position themselves within global hierarchies, and what strategies emerge as strategies for positioning. And then here I did a preliminary analysis for Brazil. To be fair, I just used 7 interviews to build on the slides, but what is important here really is not necessarily the findings, but the idea of what they mean, what legitimation mean, what claim making mean, what differentiation mean, just to give you an illustration of how this will be done on my thesis. So as I mentioned, legitimation, the idea of legitimation is sort of to so I was analyzing some of the interviews that I conducted to see how legitimation appeared in the case of Brazil. One instance that appears quite often is how Brazil portrays itself, represents itself, always referencing its institutional legacy, how it was part and important to the GATT Uruguay round, the WTO negotiations, the UNCTAD experience. So foreign policy, Brazilian foreign policy, is framed as ethically grounded, emphasizing reciprocity, horizontalism. So there's always this portraying the idea of Brazil being a responsible international actor, especially in themes like disarmament, environmental diplomacy, and peaceful trade or multilateral trade. For instance of claim making, for example, there is a recurring mention on my interviews of historic exclusions, especially from the US, and how Brazil's foreign policy is different from the US's. So it gives an idea, examples of how the IMF has treated developing countries, or how the US has financed military coups in Latin America, and that Brazil would never do that. So it sort of tries to make claim of justice through comparing Brazil to the US and how different it is. And then there's this idea of differentiation. Beyond differentiating itself from the US, it also differentiates itself from other global South countries, which is interesting because then it's sort of paradoxical because it puts Brazil in an idea of exceptionalism, as if Brazil had a more developed diplomatic reach and symbolic capital than other global South countries. At the same time, some will criticize how Brazilian elite and here I'm mentioning foreign policy elite is always looking up to Europe. As a quotation here, what matters to them is Europe, as if that were our destiny. And then here there's this idea of ambiguation, recasting hierarchy in role performance. I will go. So the idea of ambiguation is that Brazil is neither comfortably seated in the West nor the rest. So there's idea that Brazil's identity is somewhat liminal and layered identity. It is both a Western country but a non-Western country. Some describe Brazil as the extreme West. So this liminality plays out in its foreign policy discourses. At times it's used as a strategic ambiguity, but at other times it sort of conflates with what Brazil wants to propose in its foreign policy discourses. The idea of regressing hierarchy. So in most of my interview and discourses, what I realized is Brazilian foreign policy discourses does not necessarily understand the international order as hierarchy in terms of great powers, middle powers, and small powers, but in terms of issue areas, and it tries to identify in which issue areas Brazil has more capacity to influence and to invest in these areas, for example, climate diplomacy. So Brazil sees the hierarchy through topics, not necessarily among countries in every other topic. And finally, the idea of role performance. There's this idea of or persona of Brazil and Latin America and be a peaceful country. So saying that its power is born out of discourse and not necessarily military power. It portrays itself as being pragmatic, a multilateralist, a bridge builder, a normative anchor. So there's this idea of there's this legality tone to Brazil's foreign policy discourse. I think I will stop here because I'm really looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thaís. I hope everyone can hear me again. That was an excellent presentation, very enlightening. We are now going to listen to the discussants, Dr. Moraes, who's going to provide her comments on your work, whereafter we will hear from Christopher. Dr. Moraes, you have 5 minutes, and I'll just give you a warning at 3 minutes.
Sure. Thank you very much, Thaís. That was very, I found it very stimulating. I really enjoyed the way that you approached agency through TDA as discursively constructed. I think some of your main contributions are the fact that you try to overcome some opposition between objectivist, structuralist, and subjectivist approaches. You propose a relational view of agency, and I think that challenges the mainstream views that see middle power agency as exclusively as a response to great power politics. I do, however, have a few points, a few questions to ask you. In terms of the materiality of this discourse, how are you going to show it? And are you planning to select some case studies? If so, are you planning to, or are you planning to focus on some areas such as security or development? As you showed very well in your beginning of exploration of the official discourse, official narratives of Brazilian foreign policy, it is a very, very complex discourse, sometimes very contradictory as well. Even the same discourse, for example, South-South cooperation, sometimes this South-South discourse portrays Brazil as not only structurally, but structurally also similar to southern countries, and sometimes more similar to Western countries. So I was wondering if you're going to focus on certain areas or choose some case studies, and if so, what is your criteria? The second point is the difference between identity, not difference, sorry, the relationship between identity and agency. You do say that Tthe does not have a voluntaristic view of agency, but it did seem to me like it's a lot, agency is a lot more, let's say, shaped or determined by the way that a country constructs its identity. So I'd like to hear more about that. And you talk about dynamism, which is, of course, very important. So I was wondering how you're going to capture this dynamism, how agency has changed under different governments or in different times, or how similar they are. For example, the official, and I'm talking about Brazil because that's my expertise, but I'm sure the other countries also have similar examples, but how the same discourse can be articulated by the left or by the right. The other thing is whether you would consider, for example, that this narrative construction is a lot more to do with specific actors who construct this narrative and who actually implement this policy, this foreign policy, rather than something from above. I think what I'm trying to say is sometimes the same official discourse coming from the top, from foreign ministers, will translate differently depending on the actors who are implementing it. So I was wondering if you consider that, because that, I think, is another layer of complexity for your work. But overall, I really enjoyed learning about your work, and I'm looking forward to reading it when it's ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we will take your responses, or should we listen to Christopher's feedback first? Thaís, what do you think? Christopher? Okay.
Yes, please.
So,
yeah.
so Christopher, you have 5 minutes as well, and I will try to warn you when you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I'll need all 5 minutes, but I appreciate it. So thank you. That was a really interesting discussion. I know it's really focused more on the theory. We certainly don't have enough time to get into all your case studies. But my main question would be to give you a little bit of time to discuss the selection of those 3 case studies. As obviously this does move into kind of the Global South studies arena, which I think it was coined by Carl Olbesby in 1969 on the war in Vietnam at the time. And then we have later in the 80s, Willy Brandt kind of draws that Global South line, really more in economics or anything, but it's held pretty strong since. And particularly after the Cold War ended, this whole idea of first world, second world, third world breaks down, and we see the emergence of the Global South. Especially come the turn of the century, Westhead and their ilk really looking at the agency within the Global South. But more recently, we are seeing kind of a breakdown of that homogenous Global South, right? And we start to look at studies of individual countries, individual actors within those nations, and start to differentiate these nation states within that so-called Global South. And I think the project, as envisioned with this theory, does have a lot of room to build within that framework that really does allow quite a bit of nuance and differentiation between the case studies. As you mentioned, Brazil often works with that framework of power by proximity, you might say, whether it's, you know, pointing towards Europe or a lot of the 20th century kind of comparisons with the United States, but in the South American context. As you mentioned, Indonesia as that non-aligned movement, as, you know, beginning that in 1955, but kind of inherited that from the Sukarno to the Suharto regime and afterwards, and just except for like a couple of years from like 62 to 65, really stood on that verbiage of being non-aligned, even when Indonesia was extremely aligned with people. So there is something there that's quite a bit of a difference between these nations that can be brought out, which does bring me to my second form of comment, which is on that slide where you're speaking about the 4 dimensions of TDA. I am wondering if as you work through that, how much of it, given what you're discussing of your sources, public speeches, official interviews, websites, how much of this through that 4 dimensions is really looking at the process of forming agency within these state actors compared to the process of these state actors creating a narrative for public consumption that enables them to allow the public or promote the public to support their decisions, to support the country's position within the hierarchy. This what they're actually deciding behind the scenes, right? A little bit of a juxtaposition, how they come across these decisions versus how they sell these decisions might be a place that would be beneficial to think about. Thank you. I appreciate everything. This is great.
Thank you very much for those comments. We're going to give Thaís some time to respond to them, and then hopefully have some time left over for some questions from other attendees. But Thaís, if you want to take 5 to 7 minutes maybe to respond.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the comments and questions. I will try to answer as many as I can. First, regarding the idea of if I'm selecting further case studies, this is really interesting. In every single interview I did with Brazilian scholars, not foreign policy makers, but scholars, they asked me that question. In the beginning, that left me somewhat insecure, but then I actually found it that insecure in the sense if I should have narrowed down to more case studies in relation to topics and themes. But then what I found is that's a finding in itself. The way that Brazilian policymakers and scholars see the international order is through issues. So for us, we cannot dissociate the overall discourses from the discourses in specific areas. So for us, it's very specific, the Brazilian foreign policy discourses on the global environment, for example, or South-South cooperation, or how Brazil talks about the African continent. So as if Brazil does not have a greater discourse, a macro discourse, that it would be impossible for a researcher to generalize a view in Brazilian foreign policy. So I do appreciate your comment. I will not select case studies because I really want to stretch that comparison with other countries and not really do a study of Brazil itself, but Brazil in relation to these other countries and its perception of the international order. And I agree with you, quite often foreign policy discourses are quite contradictory, and this is something that I'm trying to highlight on the data. I do not want to sell these countries' foreign policy discourses and say, over time, Brazil, Indonesia, or South Africa usually behave like that because of their history of their colonial history and this and that. Rather, I want to say how the discourse has evolved over time as strategies for positioning, and how this relate to the government and administration at that time. So that also answers your idea of how I will capture dynamism. Once I will analyze these countries more or less from the beginning of 1990s to 2024, I can sort of see some changes in their foreign policy discourses. Indonesia less so, but honestly, because we had like for 20 years, we have almost 2 presidents, but actually we can see a lot of variation over time. So difference between agency and identity. I think one of the main things is that I don't see identity as fixed. And for example, if we think of Brazil, it portrays itself as being liminal, neither part of the West nor the East, for example. I just heard a talk from a South African scholar arguing how South Africa, I wouldn't put in this word, but he put in this word, was not white enough to be part of the West, and neither not white enough to be part of Africa as a continent. So there's also this idea of liminality. And this plays out in its identity, not to say that it's fixed, but it's somewhat ambiguous, and how they use this ambiguity to sort of create and net achieve agency. I'm still quite figuring out the verb there, but yeah. And then would I consider narrative construction a lot more to do with specific actors rather than something? Well, in this sense, what I did in these discourses, for example, for Brazil, for Indonesia, I analyzed 200 discourses before doing 25 interviews. And what I did was I selected discourses for different audiences. So for the national audience, for the international audience, for global forums, regional forums. So to see, and this relates to Chris' points, whether it was more about selling the country and to a specific audience, or selling the country foreign policy and its positioning, or if it has to do with the country's overall strategy. So by analyzing discourses to different audiences and over time, I can sort of grapple and see beyond the idea of selling the discourses. And yeah, and one last point, because I am aware of the time, is that if I understood you correctly, Chris, I think I would disagree on the idea of homogeneity of global South. I think this was never the case. For example, Brazil wasn't part of the Bandung Conference. It chose not to be part of the Bandung Conference because it didn't want to associate itself with the non-alignment movement. But what I think it's true, it was true back then and it's true now, is that these countries know when to sort of come together and agree to disagree in a better way than other countries would. So hence the BRICS, for example. And yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's just in time as well. We are now able to take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for Thaís? No questions at the moment. Any further questions or comments from the peer commentator, from the discussant? I mean, personally, I'm very much interested by your project, Thaís. I think that this theoretical contribution is long overdue. So I think that this is really, really great. I really enjoyed your 4 dimensions of TDA. I'm currently working on a piece about South African foreign policy, and I definitely picked up on some of these characteristics, especially the temporality, the references to history, and not only references to history, but using history as an analytical lens for contemporary issues. So I definitely did pick up on that, and I don't think that, well, for what it's worth, that you should get rid of this section, because I think it does add something to your work. So yeah, and I look forward to meeting you when you come to South Africa. Has anybody got any more questions? I don't have a question as such. So yes, that was just my comment. Okay, there was a question from Dedden from Leicester, but I think you've covered it. Do you see the commonalities among the 3 cases? So I guess you have gone into the method, the case selection, and so I think unless you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, I do see a lot of commonalities among these three countries, but I did sort of I will discuss the commonalities in my thesis, of course, but what I would try to do the most is highlight the differences, and this is more a normative commitment of myself in the sense that mainstream IR theory quite often say that global south countries or middle power countries will behave in this or that way. What I want to show is the differences in position. So that's why I'm highlighting the differences rather than the similarities, but I did come across many, for example, Indonesia and Brazil. Brazil has a tradition of talking about autonomy in terms of its foreign policy. Indonesia talks about bebas active. And these concepts are really comparable and relatable. Thank you, Daden.
And then some other encouraging comments in the chat for you as well. Are there any remaining questions or comments for Thaís? Okay, thank you so much for those questions. We're going to be closing the session now. Thank you for your amazing presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Your project is already looking like making a contribution to many of these literatures. So especially as someone who read all of the middle power literature as well, when I was writing my PhD, I find this very, very, very invigorating and enlightening. Many thanks to Dr. Moraes and Christopher for their useful comments, and thank you everybody for your attendance at this session. We're always happy to see this. The Global South Network warmly welcomes PhD students from any discipline and any part of the world to share their projects and receive interdisciplinary feedback. Anyone interested in presenting their work or participating in a session can contact Dr. Nauman Rayat, the founder and convener of the Global South Network, at the email address provided in the chat box. You will have seen the message, one of the first messages. Oh, there it, he's posted it again. So thank you very much as well from me for this opportunity. And Thaís, all the best with your continuing work. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.